Hello, Conlang enthusiasts! I'm taking a break from my usual math and science content in this video to show you my submission to Mpiua's second annual Cursed Conlang Circus. This is Mpiua Tiostouea, the language of all time. So I didn't have any clever ideas for rocks or a posteriori languages in this contest, but I think I did come up with something interesting. Mpiua Tiostouea is the language of time travelers. Optimized for the needs of time travelers, sort of, and most definitely cursed for everyone else. First, the context. When I say Mpiua Tiostouea is the language of time travelers, I specifically mean it is spoken in the many worlds model of time travel, in which going back and changing the past splits off a new timeline, and you can always go back to your home timeline, like in this diagram. Think Avengers Endgame or just plain multiverse stories rather than Terminator or Interstellar. That is, you can go back to your home timeline if you have a working quantum homing device. You do have a working quantum homing device, don't you? You don't want to have to pull a tooth or something to isolate your quantum signature to make a new one. Anyway, that's the environment that Mpiua Tiostouea developed in. And Mpiua Tiostouea needs to be a very complex language because time travel can get very, very, very complicated. As is tradition, we'll start with the phonology. Mpiua Tiostouea's consonants are m, n, p, t, k, s. That's it, just those 6. But these 6 are pretty much the most universal sounds in human language. You'll find all of them in almost every major language on Earth, and certainly all of those in the top 20. So that part's easy. Mpiua Tiostouea's vowels are a, e, o, u. It's just the standard 5 vowel system, but there's a catch. These vowels never appear in isolation. There are no monophthongs in the language. Instead, the pure vowels are combined into 16 diphthongs, 32 triphthongs, and 8 tetraphthongs, for a total of 56 vowels. Why is it like this? Even the native speakers don't know. Although one theory is that it makes it harder to accidentally speak the name of one of the outer gods. For phonotactics, consonant clusters are permitted if they have the same place of articulation, and stops can occur only at the end of a cluster. So that allows these 7. Syllables are composed of 1 consonant and 1 vowel if you treat clusters as single letters. Or it can be just a vowel at the start of a word. Also, there is no phonemic length, tone, or stress, because who needs them when you have 56 vowels? The morphology of Mpiua Tiostouea is fusional, because fusional languages are cool. And that might not sound very cursed until you look at the conjugation table. This is Latin, and Mpiua Tiostouea is crazier than this. Another important feature of the morphology is that derivation of words is often done by vowel mutation. And really, any vowel mutation can work, but there are several major patterns that will appear fairly often. And if you look closely, you'll even see them in this slideshow, especially in the verb forms. Mpiua Tiostouea does have its own writing system. Said writing system treats both consonant clusters and polyphthongs as single letters, which by complete coincidence gives us an alphabet of 69 letters. However, for most of this video, I will use the romanization shown here for the convenience of the viewer. Now it's on to the grammar, and as you might guess, it's this part that's shaped more by it being a language for time travelers. First of all, time travelers soon learn that their actions have huge effects on future timelines, effects that need to be kept track of. This means they care a lot about what is done and what results from it, and not as much about who does it. Thus, Mpiua Tiostouea's default word order is VOS. For similar reasons, it has ergative-absolutive alignment, except in present tenses, where careful tracking of cause and effect is not quite as important. There, the pattern is nominative-accusative. Modifiers precede heads, except in negation, where they come before and after. It uses a mix of postpositions and a few circumpositions, and notably, there are very few words for absolutes in the language, because in the multiverse there are no absolutes. Everything that can happen, and a lot of things that can't, do happen in some timeline somewhere. That's not really grammar, but it's important to know for later. To understand how the grammar works in detail, you have to understand how Mpiua Tiostouea interprets timelines, the temporal deixis of the language. When time travel gets involved, deixis becomes exponentially more complicated because time is no longer linear. You don't have to deal with just past and future. You have to deal with time travelers from different times, possibly interacting at different points in their respective timelines. Think Doctor Who, where the Doctor and River Song were always synchronizing their diaries. To sort through all this, Mpiua Tiostouea has to handle deixis in not 1, not 2, but 4 time dimensions. The first dimension is Ioa, or the objective linear time we're familiar with. 1945 comes after 1865, and that's always true anytime, anywhere. The second is Uea, the subjective time of the time traveler. If you go back in time, 1865 comes later in your personal timeline than the 21st century. In fact, time travelers are encouraged to keep diaries tracking both subjective and objective time so they don't get lost. The third dimension is Nsea, usually translated divergence. This is a measure of how far apart whole timelines are from each other, based on how long ago they branched off. For example, a timeline diverging in 1865 is farther away in Nsea than one diverging in 1945, regardless of the details of each timeline. The fourth dimension is the most unusual. It is called Uete, and it doesn't have an exact translation, but it's sometimes translated as negentropy. Uete is roughly defined as distance from normality, but it's normality defined in a very particular way. Not the specific path of history in our timeline, but a statistical normal where things don't get too weird or unlikely in a cosmic sense. For example, a timeline where you go to 1865, but don't make any deliberate changes and just see what happens, is close in Uete, close to the statistical normal. A timeline where you go to 1945 and meticulously manipulate events to change the outcome of the war, well, you'd be caught and disciplined by the ethics committee long before you finished. But if you did, that would be far in Uete, an unlikely event that requires a lot of intervention to happen. That's how time travel affects deixis, and that will be reflected in some of the grammar. But we're not done yet, because time travel also affects grammatical number. The thing with multiple timelines is that you can have multiple copies of the same person in different timelines. For example, suppose you're studying Abraham Lincoln. In our timeline, he was shot by Booth, but in another, he wasn't. In one timeline, he gets impeached, much like Andrew Johnson was. In another, he never becomes president at all. Farther away in Uete, he might get hit by a train, or he might take up vampire hunting, because everything happens somewhere. By the end of the project, you may be dealing with many genetically identical Abraham Lincolns with different life paths, and you're going to need a way to handle that linguistically. This also does some weird stuff to kinship terms. That's not relevant to this discussion, but it's kind of important if you want to avoid a Loki-Sylvie situation. Anyway, this multiplicity across timelines is addressed essentially by having grammatical number work in 2 dimensions. You can have singular and plural within a timeline, and you can have singular and plural across timelines, including distinguishing this timeline from a different one, for a total of 5 grammatical numbers. All nouns and pronouns, including proper nouns, inflect for these grammatical numbers. Also, there are 5 noun classes. These classes are based around randomness, as in some sense they tell you how much random variation you can expect them to accumulate in a given timeline. Nouns in Mpiua Tiostouea do not inflect for class, but they do inflect for number and case. There are 4 noun cases: ergative, absolutive, dative, and genitive, and this is the declension chart. Most noun forms use suffixes, but you can see there are 2 prefixes, a circumfix and a null in the absolutive case, because we can't make it too easy. Even so, the nouns may not seem too crazy, but it's the verbs where things really get nuts. With time travel, verb tenses as we know them stop making sense, when the past can become the future and vice versa. Making them work requires us to address multiple dimensions of temporal deixis. The result is that verbs show polypersonal agreement and polytemporal agreement. They agree with both the subject's and the object's time streams. This is the standard conjugation pattern here, although there are others I'll show you in a minute. There's a prefix that agrees with the person and tense of the object. Remember, this is VOS word order. And there's a suffix that agrees with the person and tense of the subject. Now, that applies if the verb is transitive and the 2 tenses do not agree. If they do agree, they're both prefixed. If it's intransitive, you drop the objective person marker or even the whole objective tense marker if you can. And yes, the antipassive and subject drop constructions are identical, distinguished only by the transitivity of the verb. If it's reflexive, you use a single suffix. And of course, if the subject is in the 7th person, both tense markers are suffixed because that's only the sensible thing to do. Now, you may be asking, what the heck is a 7th person subject? Well, the answer to that is no one knows. Mpiua Tiostouea does indeed have 7 grammatical persons. There are the familiar 1st, 2nd, and 3rd person proximate, and then there are 4 kinds of obviation. There's 4th person spatially obviate, 5th person temporally obviate, and 6th person metaphysically obviate, meaning the subject is in a different timeline and has no copy in this timeline. That last part is important. If it's only a different timeline, then it's usually 4th person parasingular. 6th person is also used for fictional characters because in the multiverse there are no absolutes and there are no impossibilities, so even fictional characters exist in some timeline somewhere. And then there's the 7th person conceptually obviate. Conceptually obviate basically means that the subject is anti-mimetic. Anti-memes are ideas or even entities with self-censoring or self-erasing properties, like another Doctor Who example, the Silence. And the thing about Mpiua Tiostouea is that I'm sure the 7th person exists for a good reason, but no one remembers ever needing to use it. It's a little unsettling. So this is the basic table of verb forms. I'll note that the singular here is really a non-simple plural form. The paraplural, doubly plural, and all of the 5th and 7th person forms use the non-simple plural form. You'll also note that there are 5 distinct tenses: present, near past, near future, and remote future, all of which may be conjugated in the perfective or imperfective aspect. Also, there's vowel harmony of present with past versus non-past. Meanwhile, mood or modality is marked entirely by adverbs, even for interrogatives and imperatives. The noun classes come back here. They don't inflect directly on verbs either, but they do determine the usage of near and remote tenses for both the subject and object. Basically, the class of a noun affects what is considered a long time for that noun, to use remote tenses. And that time can vary from 0 for stochastic nouns to infinite for static nouns. Now, this also means that because of the way tenses interact with subjects and discourse participants, some tense combinations are invalid. Here's the chart for perfective non-plural intransitive forms, just to give you an example. And you should be aware that this is only a small piece of the entire conjugation table. If you put together all of the valid tense, person, number, and voice combinations, you get a total of nearly 4,000 verb forms. Pronouns in Mpiua Tiostouea mark person, number, class, and case, which also requires a substantial table. Luckily, they only distinguish sentient from non-sentient classes, and the third and fifth person are marked by clitics. On the other hand, the sixth person pronouns are split into two series. There's an informal cliticized series that matches the third and fifth persons, and there's a formal literary series that have their own forms. Now, unfortunately, some of the seventh person pronouns have been lost. Scholars have reconstructed them as best they could, but we don't know for sure if they're right. Actually, we can't prove those forms ever existed. We just know that we don't have any good records of them when they should be there. But for the ones we are sure about, be sure to copy them down carefully. If we did lose some, we definitely don't want to lose any more. Whatever it is they're for, their antecedents will probably be unhappy if they're missing. Adjectives also show agreement, but unlike the nouns themselves, they agree with the case and class of their nouns, but not their number. This has to do with the fact that the properties of a specific object can change over its natural timescale, but its number generally doesn't. Here is the table of adjective declensions. Also of note is that in Mpiua Tiostouea, adjectives do not have superlative forms, because again, there are no absolutes in the multiverse. Instead, they have comparative and intensive forms. The comparative and intensive are marked by infixes that are placed after the first syllable. And there's some miscellaneous stuff on this slide here, mainly what I needed for the translation text. Adverbs do not show agreement. There's split negation like in French. Relative clauses do weird things to word order, and there are no articles. There's a link to a Google Doc in the description with a slightly more detailed grammar for the language and the all-important word list. And I included a download link for the font I created for this video, so you can write in this utterly cursed language yourself if you want. Now, to finish off, I'll recite the translation text, and I do confess this was done with a lot of audio editing. Nua sia teo astue, nio kai o soa soea, mpau so soea stua, teo stoa te, keau te umpe Mpiua. Nua sia te mpau kuea snia, nio kai moe seua, wi toi seua, peua naue eun seu koa, wi staiu toin seua, te santoan se, toe neau pe eosnea. Steoi sia teo astue, o soa soea, intiu oe, nua snian seua, piotai soa soean se, kue eau siuan pau se sniua, sua nau se, kue nua seon teu nio kai.